Good afternoon. You're watching Bharat Voice. I'm Ritika Acharya, and today we have with us Anthony Klan from Australia. Now, India recently we saw had the first ever virtual bilateral summit with Australia, and we signed 7 agreements. And we're now moving in a direction where we're going to further strengthen our relationship with Australia. Anthony Klan is joining us from Australia, and he's going to talk to us about the relations of India and Australia. But he's also going to talk about a very pertinent subject that he particularly writes about, that is the China-Pakistan nexus and a possible biological warfare. You particularly write about the government corruption, you write about national security, and you write about China-Pakistan. What is this matter? Please elaborate.
Run an investigative news site called The Klaxon that we cover a range of subjects from corporate crime to government malfeasance, and basically looking at areas that the rest of the media isn't looking at or hasn't got the time to look at or is covering not as well as it probably could be. So yeah, we cover a range of topics, and recently we've been looking at the role of China in Australia's society and a broader context. So that sort of brought me to writing about Pakistan and China and then of course of India.
But what is this particular pertinent subject that you talk about? You talk about a possible warfare, biological warfare that could happen between a research facility that China is setting up with Pakistan. What is that? Please talk to us about that.
Oh, sure. So there is concerns from intelligence that there is an agreement between Pakistan and China, an ongoing development for particularly for biological agents that have the potential to be used for nefarious purposes. So there's a big concern there coming from certain camps that this is occurring. Now we've written about these claims. Pakistan and China have denied them. Now we have quite a bit of material that we've come by recently that lends a lot of weight to the claims or to the concerns, which we'll be running tomorrow. We'll be publishing at the Klaxon tomorrow. So we've spent a lot of time looking into this, speaking to experts, digging into it as much as we can. Obviously, it's a difficult subject, but the material we have certainly stands up concerns that have been raised.
Anthony, these are very serious claims because you're talking that, there's a possible biological warfare and, there's a possibility of a research facility. Is this somewhere close to because this could be dangerous. So it'll be interesting to understand, is it somewhere close to the India border or what exactly is this?
This facility isn't immediately close to the Indian border, but what we're trying to ascertain is how many facilities there are. Now, we know that there's several joint operations between the Wuhan laboratory that's obviously quite well known now, and Pakistan. So what the world, or a lot of the world, I suspect, wants to know is exactly what is happening and where is it happening. If it's all isolated at the Wuhan lab, well, that's one scenario. Okay, well, at least we know that. But the concern is now that, and the concern from some security agencies is that tests or research is being conducted in Pakistani facilities that don't have the right protocols, that aren't up to scratch. And if we don't know what's going on, then that's a big problem. So I think that the push is to learn more. Now, of course, it's not unexpected that Pakistan and China would say, look, everything's above the board. But what we need is more transparency, basically, and it's very difficult to work out what exactly is going on. So that gives an awful lot. It does give a lot of weight to the claims, and I mean, obviously, these are claims. We're reporting the claims, and we find information, and that's the role of investigative journalists to find out what we can. But the information we've come by does certainly lend quite a lot of weight towards towards those claims.
But then, Anthony, you're an investigative journalist. You're an award-winning investigative journalist. You worked with Australian. I'm sure you're basing on your claims on something. I mean, you're basing these very serious claims. And we're also, are we possibly talking about like biological weapons also?
Well, what we're talking about, I mean, we sort of set this out quite clearly in the original story. We're talking about qualities, pathogens similar to anthrax. They're not anthrax, but if the concern is that if you have any country doing this research that has with pathogens that have a very similar makeup to anthrax, you could quite easily substitute the two. So if you know what you're doing with one, you can switch in the other. So yes, that's the concern, and it's quite a it's obviously quite a serious concern, which is why I imagine the security or some intelligence areas of intelligence seem to be quite concerned about it, or are quite concerned about it.
And I believe you're in touch with the intelligence or your sources from India, Australia, and across the world.
Well, I can't actually obviously reveal my sources, but I have numerous very, very well placed security sources. I'll just have to leave it at that.
All right, fair enough. Okay, talking now about the upgradation of India-Australia relationship to now a comprehensive strategic relationship. Now we've seen, like I said, there was a virtual bilateral summit, and we signed like 7 MOUs with Scott Morrison and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. What do you have to say about this recent development in the India and Australia relationship?
I think the Australian people are very, very welcoming of it. There's a great relationship between Australia and India. There always has been, and it's been very welcome. I don't recall seeing even one negative article about it, or reading about it. So I think there's an awful lot of support on both sides. It's bipartisan, both levels of government. So it's a great thing. It's a great step forward from the Australian public's point of view, and I wouldn't disagree with that.
Okay, fair enough. But I'm going to come to the negative aspect of it also, because there've been certain negative reports in Australia as well. I'm going to come to that, but let's talk a little bit more about China. So there are reports that obviously the two-way trade between Australia and China as of 2019 is 200 billion, whereas the trade between India and Australia is only 20 billion. So, obviously we're trying to now increase the trade between the two countries, but China, as we see, to probably gain more decision-making and to, influence the political muscle, they're trying to gain power. They're also trying to invest a lot of money into education, into various sectors, into mining. What do you have to say about that?
Well, this has been the question for the past 15 years, or perhaps more, but particularly the last 5 years, and particularly the last 12 months even. It's becoming more and more of an issue. Now, many Australian experts, and I'm sure many experts around the world have been saying similar things. Look, we need to get closer to India. We have more similar government systems, etc. And it's also good for Australia to diversify our trade and have different trading partners. It's a shame, I guess, that our government has been so slow to act on this. It's this sort of willful blindness. Everything will be right, money's flowing in. But I think now they're realizing, hang on, we're leaving ourselves exposed. And we've had this with the threats from the Chinese government regarding barley, regarding beef, and sort of suspending the markets and sales if we don't toe the line. And I mean, that's not the way you treat a friendly country. So I think that was a big wake-up call for people. They're seeing that this is not a good thing. If we're being bullied into, for example, if our intelligence decides they don't want Huawei to be building the national backbone of our telecommunication structure, we should be able to say that. I mean, that shouldn't be an international slight, but it is. And we're seeing retaliation. So I think when you factor that in, you say it's great to be able to sell your goods, of course, and your services, perfect. But then you're looking at the price, etc. But then you've got this security issue, and there's a price that attaches to that, and that really is an impact. And now businesses are factoring that in. So it might be cheaper to do business, or you might get a better deal. But that's if you're not considering the security issues and the future costs and reputational damage. And now we've got with the Chinese government saying, forcing companies that operate there to basically open up their books to them. The potential for IP theft and privacy concerns. I mean, these are all big issues, and they haven't really hit home in Australia with the consumer market yet, because a lot of people, it just hasn't really hit the press yet. And I think once that does, you'll probably see a lot of these companies getting out a lot quicker, because once the public starts to move, then they get a bit fidgety. So, I mean, for example, we've got the Chinese government saying you should have Huawei in Australia. We're upset that you don't. They're also saying if you have an operations in China, you must give us all the information. But then Huawei say, well, we're not giving all the information. Well, it's not. You can't have it both ways. And so I think people are now wising up to that. I mean, the Chinese people are fantastic, and we have a great, strong relationship with the Chinese people. We always have had as in Australia as well. Very rich history. It's just the Chinese government the last few years. It's having a lot of negative impacts, and unfortunately, and it's very sad that hits it hits home for some Chinese people living in Australia, because they might feel that, hey, this reflects on us, when it's not the Chinese people at all. It's the government that's doing the wrong thing, and that's a really important point to make.
But then obviously I have to ask you the very natural question that how's the general sentiment in Australia towards the Chinese government now, especially so after the virus?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It has taken a huge dive basically in the past 12 months. According to the polls, and the polls have said, whether you view the Chinese government favorably or unfavorably, and it's dropped through the floor, and that's been noted as being quite a very notable drop, like a substantial drop by analysts. They were sort of taken aback a little, but it's not surprising. It doesn't surprise me given what we've seen and what's sort of cut through to the general population of these sort of security concerns. And once you get reports in the news about the Chinese government threatening Australia and throwing its weight around with this wolf diplomacy sort of thing, I think Australians sort of think, well, hang on, no, we're not going to wear that. And I think that's reflected in the popularity, and I guess that has almost forced the Australian government's hand to sort of broaden out the trade base, because they realise it could become quite an electoral issue for them if they were not to not do that. But it's also a pragmatic approach. Yeah.
But then what is the sentiment in Australia towards Indians? Do you see Australia now in Australia? Do you see India as an emerging global power?
Totally. Yes, totally. India is held in very high regard, and Indians are very high regard with Australians. I mean, we have so much in common, and particularly just little things like cricket and rule of law and many things. I see very, very positive, and now it's on the radar. People are thinking, okay, well, that's much more our future. I mean, time will tell what happens. I suspect that will come about. It's just it needed that heads of government to get together and put up a framework and then get it happening, which is what we've seen now. And I suspect that growth will change significantly. Now, I saw some figures the other day that I thought I'd mention. So there's a big issue at the moment around the world, but particularly in Australia, regarding students from China. Now, there've been quite a few reports recently regarding Chinese embassies in Australia, Chinese government pressuring students and getting fellow students from China to dob in other students if they speak out against the government, which is completely antithetical to what a free country should be doing and what higher education should be doing. And so what we've got is we've got these universities that are accountable to. They're not particularly accountable to anyone. They have a Senate, and it's particularly a couple of the major universities. They're sort of stacked with friendlies, and it's all pretty murky at the moment. We're looking at there's an inquiry coming up, and I suspect things will change gradually. But we've got a lot of this has happened. Sort of, sorry.
Change to what? Change to what, Anthony?
Okay, so what I was getting at is that the number of students coming from China. Now this surprised me, because we hear a lot about the huge numbers of students from China, which is fine, which is great. But the students from India, it's not that far off anymore. So we have in higher education, we have 100 in 2020, 107,000 students from India, which is up 10% on the year before, which is a massive growth. Right. From there's 165,000, and that's down 9%. So you got 107,000 versus 165, and they're going, so it's only a handful of years before you've got just as many Indian students as Chinese students. So we'll see if that trend continues. Obviously, there's been some concerns recently, and it depends where that goes, but yeah. And they're from
But that's exactly what I was talking about earlier as well, because China is making these investments is not only the education sector, not only the coal mining sector. Now, do you think that the Chinese students could also be possibly a section of those Chinese students could also possibly question the government and not be very happy with the developments between India and Australia?
Perhaps. But I think just as likely, you have got many students from China, from mainland China, who have come to Australia to get a free education, to get a good education, to be free of censorship. Our universities are undermining that and undermining their own product by not standing up for that. And so I think it's a short-term view that might make the administrators a bit more money and have higher salaries, but medium to long-term, you're undermining your core product. And I think, and there are many students that would feel that. Many feel, sadly, not in a position to say that publicly for fear of retribution, which goes to the same problem. But there are many. You will speak to students one-on-one, and many will say the same thing, that they're concerned about this, and the public's concerned about it. So it's just a matter of what happens and how quickly it happens. But at the moment, things are moving quite quickly. There's calls for an inquiry, and we'll see there might be even further inquiries, a parliamentary inquiry. There's quite a bit of support from both sides of politics. So it's definitely becoming, the whole issue is becoming more of a story than less. That's for sure.
No, that definitely makes a lot of sense, because in our last interview, which we did particularly on China, when we were interviewing Jennifer Zeng, who fled to US, she was exactly talking about, why people flee to other countries from China, because they want free education and they want better facilities. All right. So since we're talking about education, I also have to, ask you that we also see that there's a popular or a very rampant trend that we're seeing, that a lot of Indian and Asian students come to Australia. And, I was recently watching a report where the Australian academia is not very happy with this, because, these Indian students don't particularly go through a test or a merit or any English examinations and stuff like that. And they're just given admission into Australia without any checks and balances. So this is become like a formula from the Australian universities to earn a quick buck. Is that the case?
Yes, it is. And it's an enormous issue. And again, that goes back to, in my opinion, self-serving administrators, self-serving vice chancellors looking to increase their salaries, basically, if it boils down to it. You've got the salaries of vice chancellors, for example, the vice chancellor of Brisbane's been in the news, or the University of Queensland, rather. Now, his salary is about 1.2 million Australian dollars a year, which is remarkable. And on top of that, he's got bonuses for getting close to China was one of the bonuses we found out recently, $200,000 a year. So they're highly incentivized from a monetary perspective to get as many people through the door. And I mean, these guys, people, they're in the job for 3 years, 4 years, maybe 5. So they're looking to maximise their money. We've got, since the Australian government defunded the higher education sector, which was the heart of the problem years ago, probably 2 decades ago now, under John Howard, the Conservative leader, Prime Minister at the time. There was a vacuum of funds. So you've got at the one time you've got much less money coming in, but you've also opened it up to the private sector. So you've got the sort of finance types and big money sort of people coming in, and then it's all about money. So then obviously this is really this was quite a predictable outcome. I think it's much more severe than many had thought, even on the worst end of the spectrum. But that's what we're left with now. It's difficult to prove exactly how much of an impact this is having on student outcomes, on the watering of degrees. But just speaking to people on the ground, speaking to lecturers, speaking to professors, it's definitely a problem, and it needs to be sorted. If we're going to continue to have a world-class education system, as we claim to do, and as we do in many respects, I suspect. But if we're going to keep that, we need to sort that out. And obviously, and as you said, you've noticed this is an issue, and it certainly is.
Absolutely. Okay, all right. You also in Klaxon, which is your own website, your own investigative website, you also talk about government corruption. What is the national sentiment in Australia for your Prime Minister Scott? And is he seen as a guy who's a nice government or not a very corrupt government? What is it?
He is seen more favourably than he was. Last year we had this terrible bushfire season over our summer, and he was missing in action. So he was off in Hawaii on a holiday, which is extremely poorly timed. And I mean, all the time when you need a leader to stand up, he said, "I'm not going to be hosing, a fire hose in my hand." Well, obviously not. But you need to have that person standing there and corralling the troops, as it were, or getting the support and keeping the country, from a morale perspective. So he took a really big hit to his popularity from then, and I think he sort of realised that he was on his way out unless he lifted his game. With the current COVID crisis, his popularity has come back up again, quite a lot, and that'll happen at times of emergency, provided you don't go to Hawaii, basically. So he hit it up this time. So he's back again, but his government has been in power now for many years. And as happens with any government, after you've been in power for too long, the corrupt structures just manifest and get deeper and deeper and deeper. And so the amount that his government, our current government, is captured by, for example, the mining industry, the gas industry, and the big banks, the finance industry, is extremely concerning. You've got the revolving door We've got people in the industry becoming MPs, silencing journalists. We've got a pretty very concentrated media in Australia with only a couple of proprietors, and so that makes it very difficult. And that was one of the reasons I went out on my own and set up my own newspaper. But I think that the biggest problem that our current government has is this sort of cronyism that's just become standard almost in many cases. I mean, it keeps me in a job, but it's not good for the country, basically.
Okay, so since you're talking about not good for the country, I'll tell you, we were talking to a couple of our Australian friends, and we were on a holiday in Japan, and we were talking to them, and they were telling us that we were talking about the Adani Reef. Now, obviously, it's all over the news now, the Adani thing. The Adani is a very big Indian enterprise, and they are investing $3.6 billion in the Australian market in Australia. And while on the other hand, people are saying that it'll create many jobs, our friends at least were in the favor of the fact that it'll create thousands of jobs. There are people, the activists, the coal mining activists, who are not happy with this Carmichael project, and they're saying that it could harm the reef. What do you have to say about that?
There's 2 points on that. There's certainly the direct impact of the reef from shipping coal straight through the middle of the reef. That's an issue. The broader issue, of course, is the climate change. I mean, if you're digging up all this coal when we've got cheap, renewable solar, wind, what are we doing? I mean, why are we encouraging this sort of activity? And it's become, I mean, Adani has quite a colourful history in India, shall we say. And I've having read quite a bit, and there's been quite a bit in the Australian media about this. The ABC's done some great work in that area. But I think it's become such a partisan issue, whether you support Adani or don't support Adani in Australia, has become a sort of a right political issue, which is a shame because it's not being argued on its merits. And a lot of that has been how successful the campaign has been from the industry on the ground, lobbying, meeting politicians behind the scenes. It's interesting. It's not happening anywhere as quickly as one would have thought, given the support from governments, or at least the green lighting. And a lot of that's because lenders are pulling out. Lenders, we had one the other day in Malaysia, major Malaysian lender wasn't getting involved because they realised, because the viability of the entire project is questionable. It's very questionable, particularly with coal.
Because I believe the facility shut down, and then now they're finally in January, I think they got the checks and balances in place again. But what's the recent development of this?
Well, now the lenders are jumping ship. The lenders don't want to lend because to some degree, because of pressure from environment groups or from people who just basically think it's a bad idea, but also because it doesn't stack up. And it's probably more because it doesn't stack up, I suspect, because you don't want to be left hundreds of millions of debt or billions that you're just not going to get back. So it's a combination of the two. And every month that goes by, there's fewer and fewer coal plants opening. I mean, more closed last year than opened, I read recently. So that's, it's not entirely the most viable of options, I suspect. And the longer we go down, the longer this drags out, the less viable it is, of course, because you've got solar energy that's super cheap, particularly in Australia. We've got endless space for such projects. So the Australian government is just captured by the coal and gas industry. So they're trying to push this forward, but what's happening is behind the scenes, private enterprises going and just setting up green energy. I mean, we're setting up pipelines north, and that's all firing along. So it's going to happen regardless, no matter what the cronies say, no matter what they get, how much they get in the road. It's going to end up going the right way. It's just a matter of how much damage they cause in the process, how much they slow that down, and, for example, how much they during the COVID crisis, for example, Scott Morrison set up a gas industry lobby group, more or less, within his government. Now, the idea of this was it's called a COVID commission, but it was stacked with gas executives. And funnily enough, their answer to the corona crisis was more gas, like developing more gas. But we know that gas is almost as damaging as coal, depending on the emissions. You're around 2-3%. You get more emissions than that, as in the methane is emitted into the atmosphere and not burnt. Then it's as bad as coal or worse. So it's this furphy that it's a transition fuel. It's just not the case. I mean, you could have a couple of plants to help out at times when the wind isn't blowing, or to keep the system running, and that's fine here and there. But that's a very different prospect to running gas and running everything on gas. Now, it's just a matter of whether that gets through properly to the public or not, and the government can get away with it, because so many of these things are just not the right way to do it, and the government must know. But they're pushing ahead anyway, and our opposition at the moment is quite weak, which is sad. But the more that gets on the public, the less chance they have of getting it forward. So, yeah.
So you're saying it will happen, but it'll probably happen at a slow pace because the opposition is also weak. So it will definitely happen. But then, I also have to ask you about the Great Barrier Reef Festival, because so much so in this particular year, we've talked about the environment and so much has happened. We cause harm to our own environment. What is happening in Australia about the Great Barrier Reef, and how would it be protected now?
Well, there's obviously quite a few projects on the board to protect the reef, but overwhelmingly, it's an issue of global climate change. So it's not really the biggest problem for the reef is the warming planet. It's you've got the warmer the water, coral bleaching events occur, and the reef has really struggles to repair. Now that's been happening for 20, 30 years, but it's definitely magnified a lot recently. So it's a global issue. But in Australia, dragging its feet on climate issues, which this government has done, our previous government was actually great on this, bringing a price on carbon, bringing the world's first green bank, which basically uses public money to invest in solar farms, wind projects, that sort of thing, along with the UK. And we led the world in that. But then that government was replaced in 2012-13. And since then, basically the current government's just try to dismantle a lot of it, to in my opinion, to the country's detriment, and not just environmentally, financially, because if you build a new coal plant, then that's a stranded asset, and the taxpayer ends up paying for it. And the benefit is that the current CEO and I guess the MPs get a few $1,000s donation so they can get elected again. So I don't mean to sound cynical, but that's pretty much how it's operating.
Okay, all right. I also have to ask you lastly, about this whole the agreement that, again, I'm going to mention the agreement that India and Australia signed, and we also talked about intelligence sharing. We also talked about, tackling global terrorism. What do you have to say about that? Is India and Australia going to tackle terrorism together and probably tackle issues together?
Yes, the document was quite extensive and quite an impressive report, I felt. The terrorism, to a degree, but I think the main components there that jumped out at me were trade was a big one, education, particularly rare earth metals, such as which we know can be used in the future. Probably the future of warfare might well come down to lithium and those sort of materials. Not just warfare, but I mean technology, chips, high tech, basically. So we need to protect that. And I think both countries have realized that's an area for the future. So they were the main things that jumped out at me. Yeah. But of course, setting up a dialogue and getting the departments working together and getting it going. And they've covered a broad base. And I guess it'll depend on which areas need the most attention at the time. But the framework's certainly there and the will's there, as far as I can tell. So I think it has every chance of flourishing with any luck.
Great. I have to ask you the very last question, which is about the Indian Ocean region. Of course, we cannot ignore that. So I do you think that the defense agreement and all the agreements between India and Australia could be a possible check on China?
I'm sure. I mean, it just depends on what China's quite unpredictable, as we know, or the Chinese government's quite unpredictable. I'm sure it'll have that effect. Well, I imagine that's something of the intent. In order to basically say, hang on, it's not okay to be acting against the international law. Like, you can't just do this. And for a long time, everyone's just sort of sat on their hands, which I thought was kind of a little bit strange. But I guess now politicians have been forced to do something because this is a problem. You can't have a major country just breaking international laws and pushing everyone around. So unfortunately, we kind of have to. Our countries are sort of other countries need to do something back, and that's what this is. This is what this is about, and I guess it's the start of it, and we'll see what happens. But looking at the naval exercise that India is involved in, and Australia may well be involved in, I imagine that'll continue and ramp up, but it'll be definitely a space to watch.
All right, all right. So that's something we'll see in the future. We've spoken for 30 minutes. Thanks a lot to Anthony for joining us. Sorry for the recent hiccup in between because I couldn't hear my voice clearly. But I have to say this on a lighter note that on one hand, while we know that Australia has beat India in cricket many times, but at the same time, you get for MasterChef Australia, you get the maximum viewership from India, and we're like crazy about it. So we love it.
Good stuff. I'm happy. I'm happy.
Thanks a lot, and thank you so much for joining us and talking to us about your investigative journalism and about your page Klaxon. And you obviously keep talking about a lot of issues that China is possibly involved with. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.